Is wholesale a good idea for online retailers? Wow, a big question. It's one that I get a lot in my coaching groups. And the answer is it depends, because what's right for you might not be right for me, and so on, and vice versa. So there are definitely some advantages, but also some serious risks. So let's go through both sides now and have a look. Welcome back to the e-hustle. This week, we're going to talk about the pros and cons of wholesale for an e-commerce brand. Now, as always, if you like the e-hustle, you can check out the written version on my website at learnecommerce.com. You can see tips on my Instagram and TikTok and YouTube channel at Paul Waddy e-commerce. Most importantly, if you like this podcast, please do like it, rate it 5 stars and subscribe. It all helps. Right, let's get into it. So this one is a bit of something that's close to my heart, because I started out in 2005 maybe, or 2006 maybe, as a wholesaler. I started a brand and I thought wholesale was where you made the real money, and boy was I wrong. Now, that's not all negative. We're going to talk about the pros and cons today, but I'm certainly going to talk about my experiences and what you should look out for. So I guess let's start by asking myself, what was my first experience with wholesale like? And I started my first business wholesaling men's shoes. I started a men's shoe brand called Antoine & Stanley, and I took out a loan. Firstly I went to China, Guangzhou, and I filled a suitcase with shoes, brought them back, lugged them around Australia, and got a lot of success, and then eventually had clients all over the world, really. South Africa, the UK, ASOS, David Jones, all sorts of brands buying my product. It was pretty exciting and a good experience for a young guy. Now, I did well in terms of getting lots of orders, but I made a huge mistake before I even sold my first pair, which was holding way too much stock. And so I quickly realized that, and you hear me talk about this a lot, even in the last episode of the e-hustle, that wholesale really boils down to 2 simple rules for me. Don't hold stock or too much stock, and only work with good payers. And I've been stung on both ends of that big time. So I learned it the hard way, but it shaped how I look at wholesale today. Now, is wholesale a good idea for online retailers? Wow, a big question. It's one that I get a lot in my coaching groups. And the answer is it depends, because what's right for you might not be right for me, and so on, and vice versa. So there are definitely some advantages, but also some serious risks. So let's go through both sides now and have a look. Let's talk about the good side. Let's talk about the pros of going into wholesale as an e-commerce brand. One, it diversifies your revenue stream, so it can be a great way to reduce risk, particularly when you're starting out. You don't rely on just one sales channel, so that's mitigating risk. If you ever want to sell your business, having multiple revenue streams can make your brand look more attractive to buyers, so I like that. More eyeballs on your brand, and this could also be a marketplace, I guess, but when you're in particularly well-regarded stores, you have a lot more people picking up your products and physically inspecting them, which also helps. What we don't have in e-commerce is people physically picking up the product and seeing it. And more eyeballs is always a good thing. Now, some brands would even consider wholesale as a free form of marketing, a free form of just getting your brand out there, taking small margins. And it's not my preference, but some people see it as a really good way to just get the brand known more. The other thing it's useful for is reaching supplier MOQs, or minimum order quantities. So particularly when you're starting out, if your supplier's volumes or MOQs require very high orders that are just too high for you right now, wholesale can help you hit those targets by moving large volumes. Now, in the last episode of the e-hustle, I talked about how to work out how much stock do I need and how much cover do I need, and what happens if my cover target doesn't hit my supplier's MOQs. You're in trouble. Wholesale can sort of bridge that gap a little bit. So let's talk about that first, and now let's talk about a few of the gotchas, a few of the things that you should look out for if you're intending to go into wholesale. Now, customer payment terms is by far the big problem here. Now, I learned this the hard way, and most of your wholesale customers, not all, some of you will be getting payment up front, and that's great. Keep doing that. But most wholesale payment terms are 30 to 60 or even 90 days after receiving your product. And I talk about why did they ask for that I talk about that also in my last episode of the E-Hustle, where I talk about trying to get you to get similar payment terms from your suppliers and how that all clicks into place. Now, this means you're going to be in a cash negative cycle, okay? Particularly if you have poor payment terms where you're paying for everything before you start selling it. And that just simply means cash negative means you're borrowing or putting up money and then you're scrambling to get it. So the money goes out first, the revenue comes in later, and there's usually an imbalance, particularly if you find yourself running out of money quickly. Cash positive, on the other hand, means I get the revenue first and then I pay the cost out. Simple. So I don't like giving payment terms out, full stop. I like being on the good side of payment terms. Now, and the other thing I would say on payment terms is, like, there's so many times when I was a wholesaler and I gave payment terms out of 30, 60 or 90 days, and then I would have suppliers come back and say, oh, but I'm paying you in 60 days, give me 10 grand off, or, these didn't look good, these didn't sell, can you take them back? And it just, because they haven't paid you, they have the power. So whoever holds the money holds the power. So when you've got no leg to stand on in negotiating, you just need to get paid. You'll bend to these rules. Whereas when you've already been paid, you're like, sorry, tough luck. That's it. So really, who holds the money holds the power. So I want you to remember that. Now, you'll get some bad debts, right? So some customers in wholesale will never pay you. That's the nature of business. That's the nature of dealing with smaller stores, which have a high failure rate, and retail is tough. So for me, why would I want to be putting risk on other people's businesses? I don't know those businesses. Why would I want to give them payment terms? They could be gamblers. They could have failing businesses. We don't know. We just don't know. Why do I want to float their business, right, without some form of security? The bank wouldn't give you money without security. We wouldn't essentially give money to a supplier without security or payment up front. And it's happened to me before where I've had stores close down, owing me $60,000, $70,000. Well, they didn't actually close down. They just went bankrupt and cycled through suppliers like me who were naive and just said, oh, sorry, well, you didn't have this term on your invoice. I'll never forget it. You didn't have goods remain your property until paid for in full. So we're going to keep the shoes and we're just not going to pay you. And we're just sorry, bad news. We're doing a restructure. I feel so tempted to name and shame that store because he still exists in Sydney, but that's what people do to suppliers. I'm not talking about all retailers. Some of you are good guys and pay your bills, but not everybody does. So you need to be mindful of that. And I just got tired of being a line of credit for unreliable retailers. So if I had my time again, I would never be a pure wholesaler. Let's put that out there. The other thing is the margins are so low in wholesale that you'd have to turn over minimum 10 million to hit what I would call a reasonable dream. Now, you know what I mean? Because if you're on a 10% margin, like turn over $10 million, you'll get $1 million out of that. Maybe half of that will go into dividends if you're lucky. You might have two partners. That's $250,000 each. That's not a huge pay in today's day and age for a $10 million a year business. So it's a lot of stress and work for not much money. So I prefer D2C for that reason. Now, I want to talk about particularly in the beauty business and so on, where clients want to sell to your Meccas and your Sephoras, and I do think that can really elevate your brand and play an important role. But just be really careful on the distribution, because again, if you've got too many stockists, what's going to happen is your D2C, it's unlikely that you'll be able to scale your D2C. So, for instance, recently I was talking to a $100 million a year beauty brand who could only manage about $1 million a year in D2C e-commerce, and they had thrown a lot into it. Now, when you look at that, the answer is usually that when you Google that brand, so many other brands come up, which means that they're taking your impression share. And so you're actually selling to your direct competitors. And so your cost per click goes up, your cost per order goes up because there's people fighting on it. Same rule roughly applies in Meta. But if you can understand this concept, and if you're in that scenario, just Google your brand. And if you're everywhere and you're occupying page one, you're fine. But if you're seeing all your stockists pop up, of course they are taking some of your revenue. So there can be a conflicting strategy between wholesale and e-commerce. And sometimes you've just got to ask yourself which one is the focus and just pull back. And really don't look at revenue, because the revenue might be bigger on wholesale, but look at the contribution to profit, which might be not that great at low margins. Now, would I do wholesale at all? Yeah, in some instances I would, but with a big asterisk next to that. And here's how I do it differently. So I would only operate on cash upfront terms. Maybe for your majors, but again, I've sold to majors who were terrible on their payment terms. So I've been scarred by the majors as well. Maybe I would think about it for a really high profile client, but otherwise, no, just cash up front with no exceptions. If a retailer wants payment terms, I'll just say, well, here's Amex, give them a call. They'll give you 55 days interest free. I am not their bank, nor should you be. We don't want to be the banks of these retailers as wholesalers. We are not banks, we are brands. Now, I would also only do it in markets where my D2C, direct-to-consumer brand, is emerging. So if I'm entering a new market, like say I'm an Australian brand going into the US or a US brand coming into Australia, I might use wholesale or marketplace to get exposure. But once my brand's established, I'd probably reel it back a little bit. And so what you'll often see is, Australian brands, US brands selling on Saks Fifth Avenue or Iconic or whatever, and getting good sales, but you might just test like, what happens if I turn that off for 30 days? Do my online sales actually increase? So in an emerging market, it's unlikely that you're reaching everybody, but when you're pretty saturated and you're already reaching most people know about your brand, pulling back from wholesale might cause a shift in people to come directly to your brand instead of the store. So that's important to understand. If you're a more mature brand, you could probably pull back a little bit. If you're an emerging brand, just balance that out with some wholesale accounts maybe. Now, I would never classify wholesale or justify wholesale by saying it's a marketing channel. I can think of much easier, less stressful ways to market my brand without having to give away margins and deal with slow payers and all of the stress and bad debts. If you're in wholesale, you'll get a bad debt every year, no question at all. Now, never wholesale to competitors. So if you're on a marketplace, ask yourself, am I actually selling to my biggest competitor here? And you'll know they'll be bidding on your keywords. And I've seen it in an instance where if you're not providing MOQs to your wholesale customers, so wholesale customer rings me and says, I want 3 t-shirts. And you say, yeah, here's 3 t-shirts. What I've actually seen in the past is some wholesale brands or stores throw up Google ads where they say 30% off Paul's t-shirts. And you're like, wow, they're always on sale. And they were getting the orders, and because I didn't have MOQs in place, they were just ordering one at a time and shipping them out, essentially drop shipping them off my site, which was super cheeky. So you don't want people to be discounting, but also apply minimum order quantities. Otherwise, people will just drop ship your brand. So be tough. My tip would be to apply a minimum order quantity of a carton, and then make sure that your suppliers, wherever they are, China or US or Australia, are making your cartons and putting them in that size, so that when the order comes into your warehouse, you don't have to split the order and pick and pack wholesale, which is not feasible for a 3PL at $3 a pick, roughly, but also not feasible for you. So you sell in packs. I get a pack of 20 t-shirts from my supplier in a carton. Guess what? I'm wholesaling in packs of 20 t-shirts. So we don't want to be wasting time picking and packing and sorting through wholesale orders. And as I said before, if a wholesaler is constantly running Google ads discounting the brand, they're out, they're gone, they're damaging your brand, and that's a no-no. Now, 90% of my orders, if I was to do this again, would be on indent, and only 10% would be on stock service. So what does that mean? It means that prior to the season, I go around to the stores and I say, look, in February, we're dropping these t-shirts. How many do you want? And I collate my orders, or my agent or my distributor collates my orders, gives them to me. I make them, then I deliver them. Super normal. That's totally what the department stores are doing. They'll want you to hold stock, but that's because they don't want to hold stock. If they know you hold stock, they'll get you to hold stock, and they'll just say, you know what, we'll just order it off you every 1 or 2 weeks. But again, that's going to be cash negative for you. That's not a good way to do things. Never hold stock and hope to sell it. Deliver on indent orders, which means they're already committed and paid, well, maybe not paid for in full. If you can, that's good, but indent only. If I was running a stock service, which means holding stock, I'd hold maybe 10% buffer, but no more. Your profits might be there, but your cash will be eroded by just holding all of this stock and just dripping through it. Now, while you're just dripping through that stock, you're going to go in to get the next season and the next season and the next season, and you borrow. Believe me, I've been in that cycle. Please take heed of that one. All right, so I would also just want to not be someone's stock room, right? I'm not a warehouse. I don't want to hold stock for you. Order it, and I just want to pass it through to you. So that's pretty key. So the final thoughts for me, should you go into wholesale? Now, it depends really on how you structure it and what your business objectives are. If you're doing cash up front, if you're not holding stock, and you're using your wholesale channel strategically, then wholesale can be a smart play. But if you're relying on if you have poor payment terms with your supplier and your customers want payment terms as well, that's going to break. If you throw into the mix the fact that you're holding stock, that's going to break. That is a recipe for disaster. You're going to have cash flow problems. So for me, I'd focus on direct to consumer first and only use wholesale as a tool to maybe expand into emerging markets or to land one or two prestigious stores. But that's just my opinion, having been somebody who's been there and done it. Tread carefully. And I guess the final thought would be, make e-commerce your focus. It's growing rapidly. It's still only 20-25% of total retail. In 10 years, you can imagine where it's going to be. Take control of your destiny if you have a great brand, and focus on D2C, which is really, really where the money's at. See you next week.